It had been the first act of kindness she remembered, the first time she felt seen. She never saw the man again, but that moment changed everything. Claire sniffed and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. She wasn't the same girl anymore. She had clawed her way out of the foster system, worked through college on scholarships and sheer determination, built Infinity Group from a single app idea to one of the most influential tech companies on the East Coast. She had earned every dollar, every accolade. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it meant to need, what it meant to give. Tonight, a stranger reminded her. She looked again at the drawing, at the shaky little heart between the stick figures, then at the coat in her arms, too big, too worn, but heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Langston cried, not because she was broken, but because something inside her had been gently, beautifully cracked open. The next morning, Claire sat at her desk, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, but her eyes were fixed on the crumpled drawing in her hand. The edges were worn now from being unfolded and folded again, as if she were trying to memorize every stroke of crayon. She had barely slept. She kept replaying the night before, the way Henry had offered his only coat without hesitation, the quiet dignity in his voice, the pain behind his tired smile. Something about him haunted her. Not just the kindness, but the sorrow he tried so hard to hide. She reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a small silver bell. Moments later, her assistant, Rachel, stepped in. "Yes, Miss Langston. I need you to help me find someone," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. Rachel blinked. "Of course, who?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second. "His name is Henry. I don't have a last name. He was at the 56th and Madison bus stop last night around 8:30. He gave me his jacket. I want to find him." Rachel looked surprised, but she nodded. "I'll see what I can do. And Rachel, this stays between us." Over the next few days, Claire's instructions were carried out with quiet efficiency. Her team, used to locating elusive developers and post executives, now turned their skills toward piecing together the life of a man who lived in the shadows. They pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest intersections. Henry's figure appeared briefly, blurred, and bundled in his jacket. They traced the bus routes that stopped in that area around the time Claire boarded. Cross-referenced with entry logs, they narrowed down a handful of potential riders. None of them matched corporate databases. Finally, Rachel returned with a thin folder. "His name is Henry Miles," she said. "It used to be a structural engineer. No recent employment records. I found some online forum posts asking about job openings. He listed a contact number linked to a prepaid phone. No permanent address." Claire flipped through the pages. A copy of an old driver's license photo. A LinkedIn profile frozen in time. A scan of a construction license that had long since expired. No arrest records, no scandals, just absence. Claire closed the folder. The silence in the room felt heavy. "Where is he now?" Rachel shifted. "One of our guys spotted him yesterday near the south end of the Bronx. There's an old pickup truck parked behind a warehouse. He's been seen coming and going, sleeping in it." Claire stood. "I want to go there." Rachel hesitated. "Claire, are you sure? We could arrange for someone to approach him or bring him here." "No," Claire interrupted. "This isn't a meeting. It's personal." Rachel said nothing, but her eyes softened. "I'll have someone drive you." An hour later, Claire sat in the back seat of a black sedan as it wound its way through streets far removed from boardrooms and glass towers. They passed shuttered storefronts, graffiti-covered walls, and people who moved with heads down against the cold. The driver pulled up near the warehouse. Claire saw it immediately. The old Chevy tucked into the shadows. Snow piled up around its tires. It looked like it hadn't moved in days. She stepped out into the chill. The air smelled like rust and damp concrete. Her heels crunched softly on the gravel as she walked slowly toward the truck. Through the windshield, she could just make out a figure in the front seat. As she got closer, the door creaked open. Henry stepped out, blinking in the daylight. He looked at her with confusion at first, then recognition. His expression shifted. Puzzlement, caution, then something like embarrassment. "Claire," he said, his voice rough with sleep and surprise. She offered a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, Henry." He looked down at himself, at his wrinkled clothes, the snow-dusted boots, the truck behind him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," she said simply. He frowned, crossing his arms. "Why?" She hesitated. Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did, about the kind of person who gives his only coat to a stranger. Henry gave a bitter laugh. You didn't have to track me down for that. A thank you card would have done the job. It's not about thanks, she said. It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two people from different worlds brought together by an unlikely act in a bitter wind. Henry finally exhaled. You came all this way just for that. Claire nodded. Yes, and maybe something more. The next time Claire saw Henry, he was bent over a stack of cinder blocks at a construction site on the edge of Queens. She had waited in her car for 20 minutes, watching from a distance as he moved steadily, silently, hauling, stacking, lifting in the biting cold with the quiet resolve of a man used to being overlooked. He wore a worn flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms despite the chill, and his breath puffed out in visible clouds. His hands were calloused, nails dirty, but his movements were precise, efficient, purposeful. When he took his break and sat on a low wall with a plastic water bottle in hand, Claire stepped out of the car and walked toward him. Henry looked up and did a double take. He stood quickly, brushing dust from his pants. Claire. Hi again, she said, her smile small, genuine. What are you doing here? She handed him a cup of coffee she'd brought with her. Thought you might like something warm. He took it hesitantly, his eyes searching hers. You really didn't have to. I know, but I wanted to. They stood in silence for a beat before she added. Would you come with me, just for a bit? I'd like to show you something. Henry looked down at his work boots, then back at the foreman in the distance. I've still got a few hours on shift. I already spoke to him, Claire said. Told him you had an interview. His brows raised. I don't have an interview. You do now, she replied. Henry let out a short laugh, more surprised than amused. Okay, let's see what this is about. They drove in silence. Henry glanced out the window, fidgeting occasionally, conscious of his appearance. Dusty jeans, rough hands, the faint trace of sweat on his collar. Claire didn't seem to notice. When they arrived at Infinity Group's downtown headquarters, Henry hesitated in the marble-floored lobby, eyeing the massive glass walls, the polished chrome, the endless buzz of people in suits. I don't belong here, he said under his breath. Claire turned to him. Just come upstairs. They entered a private conference room with floored toe-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. Claire offered him a seat, then closed the door and sat across from him. Henry cleared his throat. So what's all this about? Returning the coat? Claire shook her head. No, this isn't about the coat. I kept that. It's mine now. Henry blinked. Okay. She leaned forward. I didn't come to thank you. I came because you made me remember something I forgot. A version of myself I had buried under years of boardrooms and deadlines. You reminded me that real change doesn't always start with innovation or strategy. Sometimes it starts with kindness. Henry looked down. Claire, I'm just a guy trying to survive. And that's exactly why I brought you here. She slid a folder across the table to him. Inside was a job proposal, a contract, a new position, cultural and human values advisor. Henry frowned as he flipped through the pages. What is this? It's a new role, one I created. Someone who sits in on department decisions, training programs, development discussions, not to talk numbers or strategy, but people, values, compassion. You'd share your experiences, help shape the heart of this company. Henry laughed awkwardly, shaking his head. Claire, look at me. I don't have a degree in psychology. I didn't graduate from Harvard. I sleep in a truck. You were an engineer. I haven't built anything in years. You built a moment I'll never forget, Claire said softly. Henry looked away, overwhelmed. This isn't charity, she continued. This is a role only you can fill. You know what it's like to be invisible, to be passed over, and yet you stopped in the cold and gave your only coat to a stranger. That tells me more about leadership than any resume ever could. He opened his mouth, closed it, struggled for words. I'm not qualified, he said finally, voice low. Claire leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. You don't need a degree to teach people how to care, because you live it every day. Claire looked directly into his eyes and said, you don't need credentials to teach people how to be kind, because you've lived it, and that's more powerful than anything you'll ever put on paper. Henry's throat tightened. He stared down at the proposal, then back at her, and for the first time in years, he felt something flicker inside him. Not fear, not defeat, but hope. Raw, unfamiliar, terrifying hope. Henry sat alone on the bench outside the towering office building, the job proposal resting unread in his lap. His fingers ran along the edges of the folder, but his eyes stared off into the busy street, unfocused. He couldn't do it. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Somewhere deep down he did, but fear gripped him tight and familiar, the kind that whispered cruel things late at night. She's just being nice. This isn't real. You'll mess it up. You always do. The offer felt like a trap wrapped in kindness. And Henry, who had spent years learning to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true, couldn't shake the weight of doubt. He didn't see Claire step out of the building and walk toward him until she sat beside him in silence. "You haven't opened it," she said softly. Henry gave a dry chuckle. "Didn't think I needed to. I already know how this ends." Claire tilted her head. "How? Someone like me doesn't end up in a place like this. You don't build a company like Infinity by hiring people who sleep in trucks. You think I made you an offer out of pity? I think I don't belong in your world." Claire looked ahead for a moment, then stood. "Come with me just for an hour, Claire. No suits, no meetings, just trust me." Against his instincts, he stood. They drove in silence for over 30 minutes away from the city's shining towers and into a quieter part of town. Finally, they pulled up in front of a modest red brick building with a faded green awning.